We pried a square of drywall from the multi-purpose room, and the air that slipped out was wrong dry old like cardboard left in a furnace. My flashlight slid across a narrow cavity foam insulation, a pink blanket folded to the size of a lunch tray, and a disposable camera wrapped tight in a sandwich bag. On the bag, a child's block letters, "Property of Princess, do not touch." The lens stared back at me like it had been waiting for 3 decades, patient as dust. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I have lived most of my life inside a small circle. The courthouse, the lake road that winds toward town, and the low red brick school where I learned how to read and where many years later I learned how to pull a wall apart. Wood Hollow isn't big. Back then you could hear the Friday night whistle from the high school field clean across 2 miles of maple and elm, and you knew it was October because the air slid under your jacket like river water, cold enough to sting, clean enough to make you feel awake. My parents left the porch light on all autumn, not because they feared anything, but because it made the house look like a harbor when you turned in off County 12. That was our rhythm supper by 6 dishes by 7, and the 10 o'clock forecast promising a high of 52 tomorrow and frost by Halloween. Picture Day was its own season within the season. At Wood Hollow Elementary, parents ironed collars and braided hair under kitchen fluorescents. We moved around school that morning in tidy columns, class after class, following masking tape arrows on the floor toward a gray backdrop and a tripod that looked like 3 crutches tied together. There was always a smell to Picture Day warm dust from the camera lights, the sweet plastic of combs that came in a crinkly sleeve and floor wax that never quite dried near the gym doors. If you looked up, the ceiling panels were a map of old leaks, each brown ring a quiet story of a winter we'd already survived. That October I was 9 and thought adulthood meant having your own stapler. I remember Miss Henson, my teacher, telling us not to touch our hair after we stepped out of line, and I remember the school photographer, a man with gray at the temples and a polo shirt with a cigarette burn near the hem. Years later, I would learn his name, Martin Kellerman, but that morning he was just the man who told us to lower our chins and breathe through our noses so our mouths looked like we were about to smile even if we weren't sure we could hold one. He didn't hurry the kids. He adjusted the umbrella light, leaned in to check something on the lens, and said, "Attaboy," or "That's perfect," like it cost him nothing. Down the hallway, 2nd grade cued along the bulletin board where construction paper leaves spelled out, "Fall is here." I didn't know the kids by name, not all of them, but I knew the cadences, the girl who counted corners on the floor tile when she got nervous, the boy who tapped his wrist where a watch might someday go. In small towns, you learn people by motion first names later. The 2nd grade teacher was new, Miss Abigail Talland, the kind who kept pencils in her hair and smiled with her whole face when a kid got through a hard word. That morning, she stood by the door with the class roster against her hip, calling one name at a time, in a voice that sounded like a church bell wrapped in felt. Next, she'd say, and a small pair of shoes would step forward. I knew Meline Harper only the way a child knows grown-ups. A glimpse at the clinic when my mother had me in for a sprain. The nurse who asked if I wanted a grape or a cherry ice pack. She wore her hair pulled back in a way that made the shape of her jaw look strong. I didn't know she had a little girl named Meline. I only knew there was a house 3 blocks from the school where the porch had flower boxes even in late October, and a yellow dress sometimes hung to dry on a plastic hanger in the kitchen window when the weather turned. That dress had small white buttons shaped like daisies. Everyone in our town had a signature like that, something that matched the person who lived there. The Harper's house was sunshine and neat edges, a porch light that clicked on at dusk, a driveway chalked in careful loops. Wood Hollow held itself together with habits. The principal, Mr. Riggs, walked hall rounds at 8:15 and again at noon. The custodian left the side doors propped open when deliveries ran late from the district, and the bus line snaked like a yellow spine along the curb at exactly 2:50 p.m. Officer Susan Ryland kept an office near the front doors, an old wooden desk that used to be the school librarian's. She would slide out into the hallway with a coffee in a foam cup just as lunch ended, nodding at teachers, reminding us to slow down on the stairs. Nobody thought much about the big things. We thought about mittens in the Lost and Found, and whether there would be tater tots on Wednesday. I became a detective because of things I didn't understand as a child. They came back to me years later in the quiet, a scuff on a baseboard, a memo pinned crooked the way a door would bump and catch like it had been opened too many times by the wrong hand. When I was 9, I only felt the shape of a wrongness in the distance the way people feel weather pressed down before a storm arrives. That morning there were small notes of it if you knew where to listen. The multi-purpose room had been moved from the gym because the gym floor still hummed with moisture from a leak. The gray backdrop hung a little off-center, revealing a strip of painted drywall with a hairline crease that you wouldn't notice unless you were the kind of kid who counted the staples in the trim. A temporary name was scribbled in pencil on a clipboard, Mr. Blaine sub-custodian, in handwriting that wasn't the secretary's. These things didn't matter at 9 a.m. They mattered later. When I came back to Wood Hollow as a young officer, I learned the building's bones where the cinder block thinned to make space for old pipes where a closet had once been framed out and then forgotten behind a renovation. But in 1993, what I knew was the sound of soles squeaking on linoleum, the wet nylon of coats stacked on hooks the way sunlight from the south windows turned classroom dust into quiet constellations. You could hear the camera shutter from halfway down the hall click a breath, click reliable as a metronome. Kids straightened their shoulders when they heard it and tried to remember which side was their good side, because someone told them their good side mattered on days that got printed and mailed to grandparents. I remember a moment that morning when everything around me sharpened. I was tucked near the water fountain, waiting my turn to line up, and across the tiled floor, a little girl I didn't know stepped onto a strip of masking tape at the edge of the backdrop. She had brown hair that brushed her shoulders and a gap-toothed smile that looked like it was still deciding what it wanted to be. The photographer spoke to her with the same gentle run-through he gave the rest. Sit tall, chin down. Look right here. She didn't quite smile. She looked past him by an inch to a point that didn't exist for me yet. The umbrella light flashed. She blinked. Somewhere a stool scraped the floor. It wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary in the way you don't realize a hinge is wearing out until the door hangs wrong. What adults remember as paperwork and rosters children carry as texture. Miss Talland wrote with a bright blue pen that left ink smudges on the outside of her hand because she curled her fingers tight. The secretaries kept the visitor log on a yellow legal pad, not in the bound book because the bound book had gone home with the PTA president to fix a cracked spine. Someone had taped a map of the multipurpose room on the wall with the wrong north arrow turned 90 degrees so that storage looked like a hallway and the hallway looked like a dead end. None of it meant anything to a morning that promised pizza sticks and recess if the wind stayed down. My house sat less than a mile from the school, 3 turns and one stretch where blacktop ran straight and smooth for 100 yards. You could see the water tower from our living room window, and on clear days, the light off someone's chrome bumper 2 streets over. If I close my eyes now, I can place every voice from that block. Mrs. Novotny's porch swing creaking under her radio. Mr. Jensen's garage door that bounced a little before it settled shut, and my father's call from the kitchen that my lunch had grapes because the store was out of apples. Even the trains had a schedule-long flat notes that arrived around 9, and again after dinner sliding through town like a ruler drawn across paper. Order was our comfort. We took it for granted the way you take your own pulse for granted until it runs away from you. When I joined the department officer, Ryland taught me to begin every scene by listening for what's missing. Not what's present, the footprints and fibers and tools, but the absence that hums when you stand still. She'd take me into a room and say, "Don't write yet. Let the quiet talk." That skill started on days like picture day. You learn a hallway's timbre, The exact chatter of kids lying about whether they remembered to give their field trip form to their parents the rhythm of the bell. On that morning, the quiet had a new edge. Not loud, not obvious. Just a thin seam where the chatter didn't quite meet itself the way wallpaper sometimes misses by the width of a fingernail. I didn't have words for it. I had the feeling of it between my shoulder blades, a cool place that made me slow at the top of the stairs. The adults wore their own uniforms of certainty. Mr. Riggs had the habit of patting his pockets when he turned as if keys could anchor a plan. The secretary at the front desk smiled with her eyes first. When she was worried, her eyes moved faster than her mouth. On my way back from the nurse's office with a Band-Aid I didn't need, I saw her glance at the clock and then at the door with the motion-activated camera mounted 5 feet off the floor. It didn't record sound, only movement, and it was picky about what counted. She wrote something on a pink message slip and tucked it under the phone. Across the street, Meline Harper kept a commute schedule that ran like the bus routes. I knew because sometimes I saw her at the four-way where Cedar meets Hannaford, a nurse's badge clipped to her Scrubs coffee in the holder she never seemed to take inside. She returned from the early shift around 1 on Tuesdays and Thursdays. That's when the porch light sometimes clicked off and the blinds tilted to let the sun catch the glass figurines on the sill. There is a kindness in a routine like that. It allows you to assign every sound to its source, and when a sound goes missing, you notice. The day moved. The second graders finished their photographs, leaving behind the soft electricity of kids who held still too long. The multi-purpose room returned to what it always was, a space for folding chairs and rainy day parachutes, a place where the echo arrives a half beat after the ball hits the floor. I returned to my classroom carrying a library book that still smelled faintly of glue. On the coat rack near the door, a yellow cardigan hung alone, sleeves dangling with a child's patience. Somewhere down the hall, a PA speaker clicked on and released a small bit of static without words. That happens in old buildings' wires taking a breath. After school, my mother would have me sweep the garage before supper. The bristles of the push broom caught grit and leaves and the odd screw that slipped under the tire the week before. I liked making straight lines on the concrete. The sound was steady, and the light that fell through the open door warmed the top of my head, the way a hand does when someone stands behind you at church. On that particular afternoon, a wind picked up around 3, pushing loose leaves into the gutter along our curb. I remember that the porch light on the Harper's house came on a little early. Maybe a cloud passed, maybe the timer was off, maybe someone tapped the switch before they meant to. To this day, when I drive County 12 at dusk, I notice the porch lights first. They tell you more than the mailboxes do. They tell you whether someone expects a car to pull in, whether someone is watching the clock, whether supper is waiting hot or warming in the oven. On Cedar and Hannaford, one light stayed on through the afternoon, soft and steady, a small sun against gathering shade. I didn't think about it then. I only felt the evening take a half step sooner than it should have, like winter arrived for one breath before letting go. The photograph lights had been packed away. The umbrella collapsed with a small sigh, and the tripod folded like a patient insect. The masking tape X on the floor peeled up in 2 long snakes. Somewhere a jacket pocket still held a comb someone forgot to turn in. The bell schedule said we were on time. The sky said we were not. And when the office phone rang after 2 and went quiet before its third buzz, the hallway hardly noticed. But the porch light across from the school stayed on and stayed on and stayed on long past the hour it usually blinked out. The afternoon drifted into that pale kind of stillness schools get once the morning noise settles. You could hear chairs scrape papers, shuffle lockers, slam in a rhythm that belonged to kids who didn't have any reason to hurry. I was sitting in the front office then, working through routine reports. Truancy calls a parking ticket. Nothing out of step. The phone lines clicked and hummed, and every so often the intercom buzzed with that small burst of static. It all felt ordinary. Until it didn't. The first hint came as a small knock on the glass door. Miss Talland stood there, holding her attendance clipboard like it was evidence of something fragile. Her face looked wrong for a school day, colorless, focused, but lost. "She's not in the nurse's office," she said, her voice thinner than usual. "She never came back from pictures." It took me a second to understand what she meant. One missing student in a building of hundreds didn't yet sound like a crisis. Kids hid, sometimes took the long way to lunch, fell asleep behind library stacks. But there was a weight behind her words that pressed at my chest even before I stood up. We checked the nurse, the restrooms, the cafeteria, the gym. The rooms were loud with echoes, but empty of her. Her name was Meline Harper, 8 years old, brown hair, yellow dress. I didn't know her personally, just another small face in a class photo that hadn't even been printed yet. When we radioed the staff to do a quick sweep, nobody hesitated. Teachers opened closet doors and storerooms, calling her name softly at first, then louder. By the time we reached the library, even the janitor had joined the search, rolling his mop bucket down the hall like it had somewhere urgent to be. At 12:30, the first wave of quiet panic swept through the building. That's when I called Officer Ryland, who happened to be a few blocks away on a traffic stop. She came fast, lights off, just her tires whispering up the driveway. I remember the smell of the fall air when we met by the front doors. Dry leaves, distant wood smoke from someone's fireplace. It's probably nothing she said, but her eyes said otherwise. Inside, the secretary had printed out the attendance list for that day. Maline's name had been checked off as present at 8:00 a.m. Someone had written a small mark beside it like a correction, then erased it. Nobody could say who did. By the time Maline's mother arrived, the building was already locked down. Valerie Harper ran inside, still in her light blue scrubs, her name badge reflecting the hallway lights. She looked at me, then at the empty hallway behind me, and I could tell she was already thinking the worst. She's shy. She kept saying she wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't. We brought her to the classroom desk number 14, and that's when the air changed. Everything about that desk looked paused in time. The math worksheet, half finished, a single crayon, rolled onto the floor, her lunchbox still zipped inside the cubby. There was a stillness there, too, clean, too careful, like the room had exhaled and forgotten how to inhale again. Outside, the October light was starting to fade into that flat silver that comes before evening. The first police cars lined up along the curb, red and blue washing over the maples. I watched as parents gathered behind the caution tape, their faces blurred by disbelief. Some held their own children closer, others looked toward the school like it had betrayed them. I can still hear the distant bark of the search dogs starting in the woods, their handlers calling names into the trees. For a while, everyone convinced themselves it would end differently, that any minute a voice would answer back, small and scared but alive. By 4 o'clock, we were filling out the official report. Missing juvenile. No witness confirmation of departure. Last seen between 9:00 and 9:15 a.m. I wrote the details in my neatest hand, because neat handwriting felt like control. Officer Ryland stood beside me, her expression unreadable. "Do you remember your own second-grade picture day?" she asked softly, almost to herself. "You never forget the smell of those lights." I didn't know what she meant until years later when I stood in that same room again, and the air still held that faint chemical tang from film and bulbs that burned too hot. That night, the Harpers didn't go home. Valerie stayed at the station until nearly midnight, sitting at the table near the vending machine, hands clasped so tight her knuckles turned white. Her husband, Mike, arrived hours later, covered in sawdust from his construction job, eyes red and unfocused. They didn't speak much, just small phrases. She was fine this morning. She packed her lunch. She's scared of the dark. At one point, Valerie stood and looked out the window toward the line of streetlights along Main. "It's getting cold," she said quietly. "She'll be cold." There wasn't anything I could say. Sometimes silence is the only honest thing in a room full of grief. The following morning, search teams expanded the perimeter. Volunteers combed the woods, the marsh, the drainage ditches by the railroad spur. The air was sharp with frost. The first hour, everyone still had hope in their voices. By noon, hope started to sound like bargaining. When they found a piece of yellow fabric caught on a low branch, the radios crackled with tension, but it turned out to be old, sun-bleached, and brittle. The dogs lost the scent near the playground. It was as if she had vanished in the span of a blink between a flash of light and the shuffle of the next child stepping onto the mark. The photo session was chaotic that day. That's what Kellerman told us later. Kids fidgeted, props fell, the backdrop wrinkled. He'd been alone, his assistant out sick, and he'd rushed through the lineup to keep the schedule. When we asked if he remembered anything unusual, he hesitated. There was a man, he said, finally standing by the door. I thought he was a parent. He couldn't describe the face, just the presence. That was enough to keep me awake for years. For weeks after the school was quieter than I'd ever known it. Desks wiped down, posters taken off walls, the smell of cleaner lingering through Thanksgiving. The second graders went home early for days at a time. Some of them drew pictures of yellow dresses and flowers for the front office. Others asked when she'd come back like it was a school policy that lost children always did. I spent my evenings driving the same routes over and over around the lake, down County 12, past the abandoned mill road, looking for tire tracks' footprints, anything that would make sense. But the world held its secrets too tightly. 30 years later, when I opened that old evidence box, the papers still smelled faintly of autumn dry ink and dust, the kind that settles in after decades of being undisturbed. Inside was the same attendance sheet, same handwritten note, same hollow feeling that followed me through my career. I'd gone on to work dozens of missing persons cases, but Wood Hollow was the one that never closed itself off in my mind. It felt like a sentence that never reached its period. When Martin Kellerman's phone call came in that November morning in 2023, his voice shook with the tremor of age and something heavier, regret maybe. "Detective," he said, "I found something in my basement. It's a film roll from the school. I think it might be hers. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe a mistake. Maybe a damaged roll of random faces. But when I saw it, the last frame, I knew exactly what I was looking at. The yellow dress, the wide eyes, the small hand folded on her lap. And just behind her, a burned, glossy thumb resting gently on her shoulder, attached to an arm that should not have been there. I stared at that photo until the edges of the world went soft. It wasn't just an image. It was a sound trapped in silence, a scream that had waited 3 decades to be heard. In that moment, the old smell of developer fluid returned to me like a ghost, the same one that used to drift through the hallways when the photographer mixed his chemicals too strong. All those small, harmless details that once meant nothing suddenly lined up like dominoes. The erased check mark, the substitute name, the propped side door. Each one was a heartbeat in the long pulse of something deeply wrong. That night I went back to the school, now a community center, and stood in the same room where the backdrop had once hung. The mirrors on the walls caught my reflection from a dozen angles, aging it, dividing it. The air hummed with the same faint buzz of fluorescent lights that never got replaced. In one corner I could still see where the baseboard didn't meet the wall cleanly, a small seam that always bothered maintenance but never enough to fix. I pressed my hand, there felt the hollow behind it. Maybe memory is like that, something sealed over, waiting for the right pressure to give. When I stepped outside, the evening felt like 1993 again. Cold, crisp, the scent of burning leaves drifting from someone's backyard. The houses across the street hadn't changed much. The Harper's old place sat dark now, porch light still wired to that same timer, still flicking on as the sun dipped. The town had aged, but never moved forward. Wood Hollow still held its breath, waiting for a name to be spoken out loud. I drove home without the radio on. The streets were empty, the kind of empty that's not about quiet, but about absence. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine, and sat there for a long time staring at the reflection of my porch light on the windshield. Somewhere in that silence, I could almost hear it again, the faint click of a camera shutter, the sound of childhood frozen mid-breath. Tomorrow I'd reopen the case. Tomorrow I'd bring the photo into evidence. But that night, sitting there in my car, I realized the investigation had never really stopped. It had just been waiting like that roll of film for someone willing to look closer. And when I finally stepped out into the cold air, I knew that whatever we were about to uncover wouldn't just rewrite what happened in that school. It would rewrite what this town believed about itself. Because behind that little girl in the yellow dress was not just a hand. It was a door. And after 30 years, we were about to open it. The morning after that photograph surfaced, I drove to the station long before sunrise. The air had that early November bite, 40 degrees and falling, the kind that makes the steering wheel sting against your palms. The photo had been sealed overnight in an evidence sleeve, but I'd spent half the night staring at a scanned copy on my phone, zooming in and out until I could see nothing but the grain of film. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the same thing, the burned thumb pressing lightly on the girl's shoulder, her small frame, rigid eyes fixed past the lens. There was something in her stare that unsettled me. It wasn't pure fear, it was recognition. She knew whoever was standing behind her. At the station, I found Martin Kellerman waiting in the small conference room we use for interviews. Gray walls, coffee gone cold on the table. He'd brought the camera that had taken the photo, an old Canon with tape across its body. When I asked if he remembered anything about that day, he rubbed his temples and said he'd shot 4 schools that week, all of them blending together now. But then he mentioned a detail that pulled me forward. He said there was a man standing near the multi-purpose room door while he worked a tall, quiet man he assumed was a parent. Thin, maybe late 40s, Martin said, voice unsteady. Didn't talk to anyone. Just stood there. He never saw him leave. I noted the description, though it barely narrowed anything. We went over every person logged at the school that morning, staff, teachers, substitute aides, delivery drivers. That's when something strange turned up in the district's archives. A name on the attendance sheet from October 5th, written in pencil under custodial staff, Mr. Blaine, temporary hire. The district had no record of anyone by that name. Not on payroll, not through a contracting agency. It was as if the name had been added after the fact. When I mentioned it to Officer Duran, she said quietly, "That's not a teacher's handwriting. It's feminine. Maybe someone covering for him." The handwriting looked familiar to me, and it took a while to place it. The loops on the lowercase L curved the same way as Miss Talon's signature on her old classroom reports. I felt my stomach turn. Abigail Talon had retired years ago, still living in town, still teaching part-time reading workshops at the library. When I called to ask if she could meet, her voice sounded calm, warmer than I expected. She agreed without hesitation. We met that evening in her living room. It was a modest home on the east side of Wood Hollow, a space that smelled faintly of cedar and old chalk. She sat on the couch, cardigan buttoned to her collarbone, hands folded like she was still leading circle time. When I showed her the photo, she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. She wanted to look like the sun that day, she whispered. I remember telling her she was bright enough without that dress. I asked if she knew anyone by the name Blaine. She frowned, thinking. Tall man, thin, she said finally. Quiet. I thought he was one of the new custodians. When I told her that no one by that name had ever been employed there, she went very still. Then where did he come from? I didn't answer because I didn't know. But something in her eyes flickered a quick flash of recognition, followed by guilt. She excused herself to get tea, and when she came back, her hands were shaking so badly the cups rattled. I asked if she'd ever known anyone who worked under an alias, maybe someone who needed a favor. She looked away toward a framed photo on the mantel. 2 children, her younger self holding a boy in overalls. My brother used to do that, she said softly. He was good at changing names. She didn't say more, but when I checked later that night, her family records confirmed what my gut already knew. Her brother was Caleb Russell Talland, born 1954, arrested once in 1982 for attempted child abduction in Duluth. Charges dismissed when the victim's parents refused to testify. That discovery cracked the case open in a way that made the air in the office feel thinner. The next morning, we ran every record tied to Caleb alias's temp agency's last known addresses. His name surfaced under a few variations, including one that caught my eye. Blaine Carter hired briefly through a custodial agency that serviced Wood Hollow Elementary in the early 90s. No photo ID on file, just a social security number that traced back to a now-defunct address in St. Louis County. It was enough for a warrant. When we returned to the old school building, now the community center, I had the maintenance crew pull blueprints from the city's archive. Most matched the layout I remembered, except for one older sheet dated 1992 that showed a small janitor's closet behind the multi-purpose room. That space no longer existed on current maps. It had been sealed, absorbed into a wall sometime in the late 90s during renovations. I called in a forensics team, and within an hour we were cutting through drywall. The saw's whine filled the corridor dust, thickening the air. When the final panel fell, it revealed a narrow cavity just wide enough for a person to stand in. Inside were the remains of old cleaning supplies, a rusted mop handle, 2 metal buckets stacked crookedly. But there was also a calendar still taped to the back wall, its pages curled and yellowed with time. The top read October 1993, and one date was circled in red, Tuesday the 5th. Beneath the circle, written faintly in pencil, were the initials CRT. I didn't have to say it out loud. Every person in that room understood what those letters meant. That night, back at my desk, I stared at the calendar under a desk lamp. I tried to imagine what the world looked like from inside that small, airless space, the smell of detergent, the dim light leaking through a crack, the sound of children laughing on the other side of the wall. A janitor's closet was one thing. What it hid was another. The next step was tracing what came after where Caleb had gone, who had helped him disappear. We combed through old property records until a pattern emerged. Between 1990 and 1994, a small number of service contracts were signed under one agency name, North Pine Maintenance, a shell company tied to a P.O. box registered by none other than Abigail Talland. When confronted with the paperwork, she didn't deny it. She sat in silence for several minutes before whispering, "He said it was just one day. He needed the money." She looked up at me, then her eyes red. "I thought he'd left before lunch." Forensics continued scanning the school floor plans, and within 2 days the team found something that changed everything. Ground-penetrating radar showed a hollow space directly behind the closet, about 6 feet by 10 too large to be a maintenance shaft, too small to serve any purpose. The city had no record of its construction. It was sealed tight concrete over studs. When the team broke through, the smell came first dry, sour air that hadn't moved in decades. Inside, insulation lined the walls, and in one corner sat a folded pink blanket and a disposable camera in a plastic bag. Written in a child's scrawl across the bag, "Property of Princess. Do not touch." I felt my throat close. Every officer in that room went quiet. We bagged the evidence and sent it to the lab immediately. The camera was old but intact. The roll of film had 27 exposures all used. I didn't need to be told what we might find on it. While the lab worked, I visited Meline Harper. 30 years hadn't softened the lines of grief around her eyes. When I told her about the camera, she pressed a hand to her heart and said, "She used to take pictures of everything. The dog, her shoes, her food. Said it helped her remember." Her voice cracked on that last word. "Do you think she was still alive when she took them?" I told her I didn't know, because I didn't. When the photos came back, the lab tech called me into the dark room before anyone else saw them. The first image was blurry foam insulation, dim light, a child's knees pulled close to her chest. The next few showed her sitting cross-legged, eyes open but tired, a pink blanket around her shoulders. In one, she held a juice box straw bent like she'd been playing with it. It was Meline. There was no mistaking her. She looked smaller, somehow more fragile, but still composed. Around frame 19, another figure appeared, an adult hand extending into frame, offering what looked like a plastic tiara. She didn't reach for it. In the next image, she wore it. By frame 21, a reflection in a small television screen caught part of a man's face, indistinct, just a silhouette. But the left hand was visible, the skin puckered and shiny with burns. I stepped out of the room to catch my breath. The images continued past where Hope should have ended her sitting against the wall, her eyes red but alert. Then darkness, a single blurred motion, and finally a completely black frame. The film ran out there. I couldn't tell if she had taken the photos herself or if someone else had forced her to. But what struck me most was the light in those images. It wasn't the artificial yellow of a bulb. It was greenish like daylight filtered through thick plastic. The room in those pictures wasn't just the closet we found. It was somewhere else. That realization changed the direction of everything. The chamber behind the school wall might have been temporary, a holding space. She had been moved. But where I pinned the photo sequence to the evidence board and stared at it for hours, each detail whispered something, the pattern of insulation, the angle of light, the way the foam curved behind her shoulder. Somewhere in my memory it connected to a place I couldn't quite name. Late that night I replayed the recording of Martin's original statement. He mentioned something in passing, a burned hand man who used to linger near his photography setups years before, always outside the gym, never interacting. He wore a windbreaker, Martin had said, even in summer. That detail burned into me. When I pulled Caleb's old arrest photo from the Duluth archives, I saw it, the same gaunt face, same uneven jawline. The file also included a note from a behavioral evaluation subject exhibits fixation with control through repetition and renaming. I thought about that word on the camera bag, princess, and how it might have started as a term of endearment before it became something darker. I thought about the little girl sitting in that foam-lined room documenting her own captivity because she was told it was a game. Every missing child case I'd ever worked blurred together in that moment. But this one cut different. Because this wasn't just abduction. It was an erasure, a rewriting of identity. Someone had wanted Meline not dead, but forgotten. By the time dawn came, the first frost had coated the police lot. I stood outside, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the sunrise catch the frost like it was burning from underneath. 30 years of silence, and now the ground itself was starting to give things back. The next step would take us far beyond that school toward a network of false names, sealed records, and forgotten buildings. But I knew this much: the photograph we found was not the end. It was a map, and somewhere out there another wall was waiting to be opened. The night I realized the photo sequence might be a map, I spread the prints across my kitchen table and turned off every light except one lamp. Each image caught a different texture. Foam insulation, chipped paint, the edge of a vent. I was searching for anything that could tell me where that room was. The air vent became my anchor. It wasn't the kind you'd see in a school. It was industrial, thicker, the kind built for larger systems. The pattern of screws, the steel frame, it matched older state facilities built before 1970. That narrowed it to 3 possible sites within 50 miles of Wood Hollow. One of them an abandoned mental health campus known locally as the Daylight Institute. I'd driven past it dozens of times as a kid without knowing what it was. Most of it had been shuttered since the 80s, but a few wings still stood behind rusted fencing. The main building's blueprints were archived at the county office. I called a contact there before dawn and asked him to pull the ventilation diagrams. When the facts came through, the lines on that paper confirmed what my instincts already knew: the vent in those photos belonged to that building. I drove out there with 2 deputies, the road lined with bare trees that rattled like old bones against the sky. The entrance was chained, but the lock was so corroded it fell away with one tap of the bolt cutter. Inside, the smell hit first wet plaster mildew and something metallic buried deep in the walls. We moved through the corridors with flashlights cutting through the dark, the beams catching names carved by vandals. Old patient numbers, bits of forgotten equipment. The floors were littered with debris leaves, fragments of insulation. But near the far end of the east wing, the air changed cooler, stiller. The layout matched the room from the photos. The same window shape, the same spacing between vent and wall. When I touched the insulation, it peeled away in dry flakes. Behind it was a second surface foam board that had been spray-painted white. Someone had built a false wall inside the existing one, just wide enough to make it look like part of the structure. At the base of that wall, faint scratches ran in uneven rows. I knelt to look closer. Letters, shallow but visible. Help. Below that, the beginning of another word, remember. My hand shook before I even realized it. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the collision of time. That room had been silent for 30 years, but her voice was still here. I told the deputies to photograph everything before we touched another inch of it. We kept working through the day, following faint differences in the wall's texture until one section gave under pressure. Behind it was a narrow opening, and beyond that, a hidden chamber the size of a small bedroom. No window, no lights. The smell was stronger there, dust rot and something sweet, like long-dried glue. On the floor was a folded pink blanket, its edges crumbling from age, and beside it a set of old plastic beads strung on a thread. The same kind that kids use to make bracelets from. Against the far wall stood a wooden chair, paint-flaking seat worn smooth. It was too deliberate to be random. The room wasn't storage, it was confinement. I don't remember speaking for a long time. The three of us just stood there, the only sound the faint hum of the flashlight batteries. Then one of the deputies pointed to the corner. "There's something under that insulation." I moved closer. It was another disposable camera, this one crushed flat under debris. The label was the same handwriting as before, block letters childlike, but the ink had run. I read what I could. Princess... Second roll. That night, we sent the film to the state lab with a rush order. The results came back 2 days later. Only 3 frames had developed clearly. In the first, Meline sat on that same chair wrapped in the blanket. In the second, she held a small handheld radio in her lap, its antenna bent. In the third, there was no child at all, just the wall, and on it a phrase written in marker. "My name is Meline. I am real. I remember." When I saw that line, I had to step away from the desk. For years, the town had spoken her name like it belonged to the past. And yet here she was, speaking back across decades, reclaiming herself in the last way she could. I thought about those 3 words. I am real. That's what every missing child case becomes, a fight against vanishing, against becoming a story instead of a person. The next step was tracing Caleb Talon's movements after 1993. Records were scarce, but one stood out: a property deed for a small parcel of land north of town, signed in 1995 under the name C. Russell. It was 20 acres of overgrown forest, no house on record, just a mailing address connected to a P.O. box in Duluth. The land had never been sold. I called for a warrant, but while waiting, I drove out there anyway. Some things you have to see before the paperwork catches up. The road turned to gravel a mile in. Then it narrowed into 2 dirt ruts that disappeared into trees. At the end of it stood a small cabin barely visible under layers of ivy and moss. A red-painted door faded almost pink. The windows were boarded from the inside. My pulse kicked up, but I didn't go in right away. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something older rot, maybe animal decay. I called for backup and waited, the forest creaking around me. When the deputies arrived, we forced the door. Inside, the air was thick and cold like a cellar. Dust lay in a perfect layer on the floor, disturbed only by one narrow path leading toward the back room. The place looked half lived in and half abandoned. Dishes stacked by the sink, a blanket draped over a chair. But it was the back room that stopped us. Against one wall was a cot. On it lay the remains of a man slumped sideways, the body so far gone that it took a moment to recognize what I was seeing. He'd been there a long time, decades maybe. The medical examiner later confirmed it was Caleb Russell Talland. Cause of death likely self-inflicted long before the discovery. But the shock wasn't his body, it was what lay beside it. A Polaroid camera, clean and dry, wrapped in cloth. Inside it, one undeveloped film sheet. We sent it to the lab immediately. When the image came through, my hands went cold. It was a photo of that same red door closed from the outside, claw marks gouged into the paint, and one word scrawled across it in Meline's handwriting: enough. We combed the cabin for evidence. The kitchen table was covered in notebooks, pages filled with rambling sentences, references to the light, the lesson, and the princess remembering. His handwriting grew shakier as the years went on, sentences looping over themselves until they became unreadable. Near the bottom of one page was a final line. She wanted to leave. I let her go home to the light. It could have been delusion, or it could have meant something literal. The medical examiner believed Caleb had died sometime around 2018, 5 years before we found the place. When we cleared the back of the cabin, Deputy Lyle called out from the small crawl space under the floor. "There's something here." He handed up a folded piece of fabric, brittle from time. A child's dress, yellow with white buttons, shaped like daisies. The same one from the picture day photograph. I held it carefully, afraid it might turn to dust. That's when I realized something else. The hem had been repaired by hand, stitched unevenly with thread, far newer than the fabric itself. Someone had touched it long after she'd worn it. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. The records showed no evidence of another occupant, yet someone had been tending that cabin recently. The firewood stacked neatly by the wall, the canned food within expiration date, the lamp oil still half full. We sent prints from the cabin for analysis, and the results returned something impossible. One partial fingerprint matched Meline Harper's from her old-school records. I read that line 3 times before I believed it. She had been there, not just as a victim trapped in the past, but alive long enough to leave her mark. We issued an alert through the state's missing persons unit, though it felt strange to use the word missing after 30 years. But we had no timeline, no proof of when she'd last been there. For all we knew, she could have fled that cabin years before his death. Or maybe she never really left until the moment she decided to. I started driving the back roads north every evening after shift, watching for any sign of a woman traveling alone. There's a quiet you feel when you're looking for someone who doesn't want to be found. It's not hopelessness, it's respect. 2 weeks later, the call came from a ranger station 40 miles north. A woman had walked in barefoot, wearing an oversized coat, asking for water. She refused medical transport, but gave a name, Meline Harper. When I got there, she was sitting by the window, staring out at the snow line. Her hair was streaked with gray, her skin pale, her hands trembling as she held the cup. She looked up when I said her name, and for a moment she smiled, small and uncertain. "I told you," she whispered, "I remember. There's no training for a moment like that." The room seemed to slow around her, the noise falling away until all I could hear was her breathing. She'd lived in that cabin for years after Caleb's death, surviving off what he left behind. No family, no neighbors, no phone. She said she'd finally walked away when the first snow fell this year. "I wanted to see light again," she told us. When we asked if he'd ever hurt her, she shook her head once. He said I was safe as long as I stayed inside. He called it mercy. We drove her to the hospital that night. Valerie was already there waiting. When mother and daughter saw each other for the first time, neither spoke. They just held on like the air itself might split them apart if they let go. It wasn't joy exactly, more a kind of fragile stillness, like both were afraid to move too fast. In the days that followed, I filed the reports, closed out the evidence logs, but none of it felt like closure. The photographs, the cameras, the rooms, they were fragments of a long captivity that no paperwork could ever define. I visited Meline once more before she was discharged. She was sitting near the window, sunlight hitting her face, her eyes following the pattern of the glass reflection on the floor. "Do you remember the wall?" I asked. She nodded. I remember everything she said, even the sound of my own name. As I left the hospital, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and a thin line of snow dusted the streetlights. 30 years of silence had ended, not with answers, but with survival. Still, part of me couldn't stop wondering what she had seen during all those years alone, what stories she carried that she might never tell. Back at my desk, I pulled the final photograph from its envelope, the red door, the word "enough" carved into the paint. I pinned it to the board and stared at it for a long time. Maybe that was her way of closing the story. Maybe she wasn't asking for justice anymore. Maybe she'd already found it. The next morning, before the sun rose, I drove past the old school one last time. The building looked smaller now, the bricks worn down by decades of seasons. The wind moved through the empty hallways like breath through an old instrument, low, uneven, familiar. Somewhere behind those walls, a little girl had once written her name to remind the world she was real. And now, for the first time, she no longer needed to. The morning after Meline left the hospital, I drove past the old Harper house. It looked the same as it had 30 years ago, 2 stories of quiet memory, with a porch that leaned slightly toward the street. The daisy curtains were gone, the flower boxes empty, but the light above the steps still came on at dusk like it always had. Valerie had decided to keep the house even after all that time, and when I parked across the street, I saw her silhouette move through the kitchen window, slow and deliberate, like someone relearning the rhythm of living. Meline was inside too. She didn't want visitors, and I didn't blame her. After what she'd survived, the world must have felt too loud. Still seeing that faint outline, a grown woman standing in the house where her childhood had once ended, felt like witnessing the closing of a circle. The town of Wood Hollow was different now. The old school had been renovated into a children's trauma center. The playground had been rebuilt, the chain-link fence replaced with wooden posts painted pale blue. They'd left one wall from the original structure intact, the east side, where we found the hidden chamber. Above it, a bronze plaque read, "Dedicated to every voice that went unheard." Every time I pass that wall, I feel the same thing. Relief threaded with a kind of sorrow that doesn't go away, just settles into the bones of a place. The case files were closed, at least in the formal sense. Caleb's death ended the prosecution, and the medical examiner's final report called it intentional isolation leading to self-starvation. The state listed Meline as located and stable. That word "stable" always bothers me. It sounds so sterile, so detached from what it really means to live again after decades of silence. Stable is a word you use for furniture, not for a person who spent most of her life behind walls. But in the language of the law, it's the best they can offer. In the months that followed, I checked in with her only a few times at her request. She didn't like being called a victim. "I was alive," she said once, her voice soft but certain. That's more than what they thought. She talked about the years after Caleb's death, how she'd stayed in that cabin because she didn't know what the world expected from her anymore. "He was all I knew," she said. "Even when I stopped fearing him, I didn't know what to do with the space he left behind." There was no anger in her tone, just exhaustion, like someone describing a long winter that finally broke. One afternoon in early spring, I visited her and Valerie at the hospital garden. They sat together on a bench under a budding maple sunlight catching in their hair. Valerie had brought an old photograph album, one that had survived years of dust and storage. She showed Meline a picture from her 8th birthday. The same yellow dress, the same smile, frozen before everything changed. Meline touched the photo like she was tracing the outline of someone she used to be. "It feels like I'm remembering someone else's life," she said quietly. "But the girl in that picture, she wanted to live, so I did. After that, she stopped giving interviews. Reporters tried, of course, letters, calls, even one who showed up at the trauma center pretending to be a social worker. But she never spoke publicly. I respected that. Not every truth is meant for broadcast. Some stories belong to silence. What mattered wasn't the public knowing her name. It was her knowing it herself. When the investigation's records were finally transferred to the archives, I asked to keep one item, the final Polaroid of the red door. I framed it without the word enough, visible just the faint texture of wood grain and sunlight. It hangs in my office now, not as evidence, but as reminder. The door doesn't scare me anymore. It's what came after it that stays with me the moment she stepped through barefoot in the snow, choosing the cold over captivity. That was the first decision she'd been allowed to make for herself in 30 years. Every case leaves something behind. Sometimes it's a question you never answer. Sometimes it's a sound. For me, it's that click of a camera shutter, the one that captured both her fear and her defiance. It echoes in my head when I walk into old buildings, when I hear the hum of fluorescent lights, when I smell that faint mix of dust and bleach that every school carries. It's the sound of a life refusing to disappear. I remember visiting the Daylight Institute one last time before it was demolished. The crew had already gutted most of its walls, stripped bare windows, blown out everything reduced to gray light and echoes. I stood in the room where we found the message carved into the foam, "I am real." I remember. The letters were still there, though dulled by dust. I reached out and touched them, tracing each word like a prayer. That room wasn't a tomb anymore. It was testimony. As the years go on, I've come to understand that closure is a myth we tell ourselves so we can keep moving. The truth doesn't close, it lingers. It seeps into the corners of things, into the sound of leaves brushing against windows, into the way an old building sighs when the wind passes through it. For Meline, survival wasn't an ending. It was a beginning she never asked for, but found a way to carry. Last autumn, Valerie sent me a letter. Inside was a photograph taken at the new community center. It showed Meline standing by the memorial wall, sunlight falling across her face. She wasn't smiling, but there was calm in her eyes. On the back of the photo, Valerie had written in careful script, "She teaches art here now, mostly to children who've been through hard things." I stared at that line for a long time. Maybe that's what survival becomes when it's shared something that helps others find their way back to the light. I drove out there a few weeks later. It was late afternoon, the kind of day where the sun hangs low and everything glows gold. From the parking lot, I could see her through the window sitting with a group of kids gathered around a table of paints and brushes. She leaned over to help a little girl adjust her canvas, and for a moment she laughed, a sound so ordinary, so human, it felt like the world exhaled. I didn't go inside. Some reunions don't need witnesses. I just sat in the car watching that light spill across the room and thought about how far she'd come from the darkness that once kept her. When I left, the sun had dipped below the trees and the first stars were starting to show. The highway back toward town was empty. I rolled the window down, letting the cool air fill the car, and thought about how memory can both wound and heal in the same breath. Somewhere behind me, the old story of Wood Hollow was folding itself into history, no longer an open wound, but a scar the town had learned to live with. And yet even now I keep one thing from that case close to me, a single frame from her old camera. The one where she's sitting in the foam-lined room, looking just beyond the lens, her eyes steady. I never filed that one with evidence. It felt wrong to let it disappear into a box. Sometimes, when the station goes quiet at night and the world feels too heavy, I take it out and look at it under the desk lamp. There's no fear in her expression anymore, just something deeper, a kind of knowing. That's the part of this work that never leaves you the realization that even in the darkest rooms, someone might still be waiting for the light to find them. And when it finally does, it changes everything. So when people ask me what happened to the girl in the yellow dress, I tell them this: she walked out of the dark and into her own story. She remembered her name. She built a new life, and she learned to use her hands again, not to claw at walls, but to paint sunlight on them. And sometimes when I drive through Wood Hollow at night and past the school where it all began, I still see that porch light glowing in the distance, steady as ever. It doesn't feel haunting anymore. It feels like a promise that even after the longest silence, someone will still be there keeping the light on, waiting for whoever's lost to find their way home.